YouTube! A couple of years ago, I made a video discussing the rudiments of gender and how the understanding of gender has changed. But before I get into that, I want to quickly remind you all that if you've been missing me on this channel, you can still watch me every week on The Breakfast Club. I post a video there every Saturday discussing a range of topics, and the relevance of my little plug session there is that one of my latest videos was, in part, about gender. In order to understand the first half of this video, you should watch my Breakfast Club video, Fake Rage, first, if you haven't already. To sum it up, the discussion involved the terms ladies and gentlemen being addressed to a high school class, and a student, whose gender identity is unknown, called out the speaker, in this case the teacher, in class by saying that the phrase is offensive because it reinforces the gender binary. From my standpoint, it was evident in that particular scenario that the speaker used the term as a show of respect to his audience and obviously had no intention of possibly excluding anyone. I also made sure to differentiate situations like this with actual verbal abuse, and further stated that anyone who claimed to be offended by such an innocuous greeting was likely expressing manufactured outrage just for the sake of complaining. There were a few people who not only disagreed with my assessment, but concluded that I simply didn't understand the issues and daily struggles of those who are transgender. The ones who completely misinterpreted my video to the point where they heard a totally ass-backwards message from the one that I actually stated, asserted that I, the mongrel half-breed offspring of blacks and Jews, two of the most reviled ethnic minority groups in the world, both having been subjected to discriminations, lynchings, slavery, and wholesale pogroms for the better part of 5 centuries, was advocating the grin and bear it method. Bitch, please! I challenge anyone to quote me or cite the timestamp in the video that even mildly suggests that. I double dog dare ya. I'm looking at you, Sequester Zone. Has anyone ever told you that your reading and listening comprehension skills absolutely suck? Or maybe they picked up some subliminal backmask messages, like the ones that people used to accuse Judas Priest and Ozzy Osbourne of doing in their music. Now, there are many issues regarding gender and transgender that remain widely misunderstood in society at large. And I think it's absolutely vital that people become educated on these subjects and how our understanding of these things have changed. But focusing on terminology and semantics and getting offended when people say something that is a little archaic regardless of their intent doesn't help to improve anything.
You will slaughter the innocent and frail. Oceans of blood will rain down upon you unless you kowtow to the ruling class, no matter how oppressive the regime. Because, that's totally the position I would take. My video library, stretching back years, clearly demonstrates my history of sucking the political cock of the man. Haven't I always said you gays and lesbians should just bend over and take it and stop trying to redefine marriage? And feminists are just man-hating bitches trying to be all like, ooh, the wage gap. And yeah, if you don't want to get shot by the cops, how about you just stop being black for once, am I right? Did you ever notice that white mass shooters are usually taken alive, while unarmed black guys hardly stand a chance against the cops? Yeah, that sounds about right. So, anyway, Chris Christie, 2016, cool.
At any rate, all of that straw-manning tripe came from people who, 1, heard what they wanted to hear, and 2, knew nothing or little of my own background on the topic, nor seemed to care about that at all. What I found to be quite telling is that the overwhelming majority of them were themselves cisgender, which makes me all the more skeptical of just how offensive this particular phrase in this context supposedly is. Some even made the argument that context and intent behind words ultimately don't matter, which to me is not only a very petty attitude to have, but one that is totally irrational and indicative of someone of weak character and very thin skin. For example, the terms sir and ma'am have been permanently edged into my vernacular due to my years in the military. Those terms were taught to me to denote respect and formality with others, usually strangers. I've used those terms countless times over the years, and it's very likely that I've accidentally misgendered someone using them, because not all trans people are intuitively obvious or present as the gender that they identify with. Is it reasonable to be upset in such situations? I don't think it is, because those would have been honest mistakes. Now, if someone deliberately misgenders someone, which, by the way, has occurred in this conversation by those who, ironically, have accused me of being insensitive to the trans community, then that's a totally different matter altogether, as the context and intent are clearly different. And I also want to point out that being offended or claiming to be offended is not an argument. It is a conditioned response to statements, ideas, or behavior that defies someone's sensibilities and worldview. If you do not possess the personal resolve to overcome it, that is your problem, and you are the problem, not that which offends you. I don't accept that excuse from religious people. Why should I accept it from anybody? How exactly did the Black Civil Rights Movement make the terms nigger and negro and colored fall out of public favor? Did the activists of the day go around screaming at people not to use those terms? Or were they more concerned with the climate of hate that was fed from the legal discrimination that hindered their rights and protections? History teaches us that the activists tackled the most pressing problems of the day, like physical attacks, lynchings, voter suppression, police brutality, Jim Crow, which, through doing so, ended up overthrowing the dominant social climate that taught bigots to think of Black people by those terms in the first place. That is how change works. You tackle the biggest and most important issues, and the big changes naturally lead to smaller changes. Squabbling over every tiny mention of the gender binary only serves to distract people and undermine the entire movement as being a giant parody of itself. And so I ask again, what the fuck is wrong with people? There are still no federal protections for the statuses of LGBT people. Depending on the state, one can still be fired for being gay, and trans women are constantly being harassed for using public restrooms and locker rooms that correspond with the gender that they identify with, all with the excuse that their very presence is a threat to real women and girls. It's not that gender terms shouldn't be discussed at all, because I never said nor implied anything remotely close to that sentiment. Being more concerned with legal discrimination and daily harassment rather than benign phrases like ladies and gentlemen that are clearly not meant to offend anyone is hardly the mark of someone who doesn't understand nor care about the trans community. As one trans individual colorfully summed it up, say ladies and gentlemen, not a single fuck will be given. But if you keep me out of the bathroom, I'll be eating nachos out of your hollowed out skull in front of your children. And if anything has bothered me personally, it's this disgusting practice of self-proclaimed allies turning their advocacy of their mascots of choice into a contest of who's the better supporter. I find that attitude to be unconscionable and exploitative. Oppressed and disenfranchised groups are not tools to be used for brownie points and social ladder climbing. Moving on, I want to talk about the practice of labeling ourselves and labeling others. And to keep from getting a little dry, I'm going to put on some groovy background music. Ah yeah, that's what I'm talking about. Okay, obviously there are certain demographics that we each automatically fall into, such as ethnicity, nationality, sex, age groups, socioeconomic class, etc. I'm not talking about any of those, because I personally don't find much value in categories that are not much more than consequences of birth and place of birth. I'm talking about that which labels our ideas and subjective experiences, such as our gender, our sexuality, political beliefs, things like that. As for me, the only label that I'm totally comfortable with is atheist, and that is because that term means only one thing. I don't believe in gods, or anything supernatural for that matter. I think that term adequately describes my position for that particular question. But everything else seems to fall short of sufficiently describing an aspect of who I am and how I perceive myself. To keep from getting lost in translation, I'm going to define some terms as I go along. When I say the words male and female, I'm talking about biological sex, which falls into three main categories: male, female, and intersex. This is merely the biological reality of our anatomy, which is determined by the 23rd pair of human chromosomes. If they are XX, the individual is female. If they are XY, the individual is male. If there is an anomaly that causes some variant of chromosomal abnormality or exposure to excess androgen or insensitivity to certain hormones, then that can result in an individual who is intersex, meaning that the person cannot be classified as biologically male or female. Biological sex is almost always unchangeable. It's in our DNA, our development, and we are what we are. This is why I try not to use the terms male and female when describing gender or gender identity, which describes the subjective feelings and experiences of masculinity and femininity in people. For gender, I usually use more common descriptors like man, woman, guy, lady, boy, girl. For example, I wouldn't say that only women can give birth because trans men have given birth. I would say, however, that only females and some intersex people can give birth, and that would be an accurate statement because I'm only referring to biological sex. You with me so far? Transgenderism is when a person's gender identity does not fit the societal gender roles ascribed to that person's biological sex. Most people usually only think of one form of transgenderism, transsexuals, which are people who experience dysphoria with their biological sex and desire to live fully expressing the gender that they identify as. The two terms are often used synonymously, but there are other forms of trans people. There are also genderqueer or non-binary people who encompass a whole range of identities: third gender, bigender, pangender, gender fluid, genderless. There are so many names that are used to describe the variants, and these would be the people who would be the most affected by a phrase like ladies and gentlemen. Genderqueer people don't identify as one gender, but find their subjective experiences riding multiple genders or none at all, which is why, with this particular context of that phrase, I'm much more interested in how actual non-binary people feel about it rather than those who presume to speak for them. My boyfriend Rob, DevShell2, is non-binary. He identifies as gender fluid. He's also gay. Both of these terms tend to confuse people a lot, and he's explained his position many times, but obviously he can't always reach everybody. Gender fluid is when someone's gender identity fluctuates. He understands that most people in society would classify him as a man, and he certainly expresses masculine appearances and qualities a lot of the time. But he also expresses femininity as well. He even altered his body as part of that expression. For a time, he took testosterone blockers and estrogen to grow breasts. This has been common knowledge among those who have known him during the years he's been on YouTube. Now, during this conversation, there were a few people who misgendered Rob by claiming that he is not genderqueer because he often refers to himself with male gender descriptors. Mind you, these are the same people who claim to be allies of the trans community, and yet they display such ignorance of those who are different from what they are used to. And they accuse me of not understanding these issues. How's that for irony? The defining factor of someone's gender are not pronouns and terminology. It is that person's own subjective experiences with masculinity and femininity that makes the determination of who they are. And the fact that Rob has reasonable enough expectations as to understand that most people that he encounters will likely address him as he appears to be does not invalidate his gender identity. Nobody can assign an identity to another person, nor can anyone assign a sexual orientation to another person. Rob is gay because his inclinations are overwhelmingly for men. Just because I'm not a man doesn't change that. Sexuality is not defined by what gender one's partner is. And for those who insist that he's bisexual, when he fully rejects that term as inaccurate in describing his sexuality, that label is for your own benefit, not his. Now, for the record, Rob does understand the confusion of someone who identifies as genderqueer to label his sexuality as gay, which means one who is sexually attracted to the same gender. And for that reason, he's reconsidering if that label actually is accurate, as it doesn't quite acknowledge his gender. I believe the alternative term is androphilic, which is the sexual attraction to men or masculinity. But do you see why labels tend to fall short? I said before that the only label I identify with is atheist because it's the only one that I feel accurately describes me in the question of theology. When it comes to sexuality, I gave up trying to define it when I realized that I wasn't really doing it for me, but for the contentment of others. I don't call myself heterosexual. I don't call myself homosexual. I don't call myself bisexual, or pansexual, or omnisexual, or asexual, or polysexual, or androphilic, or gynophilic. I like who I like. My inclinations are more for particular character traits than they are for gender itself, and I tend to form short-lived crushes disturbingly often, but the actual desire to get sweaty and naked with someone is so rare for me that it requires a hell of a lot more than just, well, hey, you're pretty hot. Now, some people would say, well, that makes you demisexual, but I reject that term too because it denotes someone who is largely uninterested in sex, and that's not me either. And I don't care, because I'm comfortable with not putting a label on it. The labels are for everyone else's comfort, not mine. As for gender, I don't label myself with any of the various terms because I can't. I would obviously be classified as a woman by society, but honestly, I've always felt really weird when people call me that, or even the few times that I've referred to myself that way. Woman, lady, just doesn't sound right. And being called a man would be just as bizarre. However, when people use the colloquialism guys referring to a mixed group, such as, hey guys, how's it going? I don't find that to be strange at all. But what does it even mean to be a woman? What does it mean to be a man? We've already established that it's not biological sex and anatomy that determines gender. So what does? Well, most of us grew up being taught particular gender roles, which are preset ideas of behavior, traits, and social positions that are assigned to men and women, when in fact they have more to do with masculinity and femininity. And I think most of us will agree that masculinity and femininity are not relegated to just one gender or another, but can be experienced alternately or simultaneously. For example, what once made a man was being the provider, the protector, the gruff and strong and brave, jar opening, furniture moving, car fixing, sports obsessing, door holding, date paying, girly ogling, arm flexing, testicle scratching, risk taking, spider squishing, pain ignoring, emotion stifling, alpha male posturing, father son fishing trip planning, daughter's boyfriend threatening, scary noise in the middle of the night investigating, king of his castle. But then we marched bravely off the set of Leave It to Beaver and realized that women can fill these roles too. Conversely, there is nothing emasculating about men who are gentle and nurturing, sensitive and caring, cook and clean, raise children, enjoy fashion, shopping, dancing, and Katy Perry. I myself encompass many of the traits I just listed off describing the gender roles of men and women. Well, except for the Katy Perry part. What else? Is it appearance? I do wear makeup sometimes. My hair is long and I suppose most of my clothes are kind of girly. But there are plenty of men with a far girlier appearance than mine and don't identify as women. So it's not biological sex, it's not gender roles, it's not appearances. So what else is there? What does it mean to be a man? And what does it mean to be a woman? I don't know. Maybe they don't really mean anything anymore. Then there are the various philosophical and political labels, and certainly none of them have ever sufficiently described me at all. Not only that, but they all tend to be extremely polarizing. Just ask anyone who openly declares themselves to be a feminist, or a masculinist, or a liberal, or a conservative, or a libertarian, or an anarchist, or a socialist, or any political or philosophical label that exists. My positions, my beliefs, my worldview could never be accurately described by these labels. And they wouldn't be for me anyway. As I keep saying, labels are for everyone else's convenience, trying to fit the people they encounter into the pieces of the gigantic jigsaw puzzle of their lives. You're a trigender, pansexual, left-leaning, neo-pagan, libertarian feminist too? So am I. Hey, let's go find a cisgender, heterosexual, anarcho-capitalist douchebag and beat the hell out of him.
She was pure, every ounce. mama show. When her titties bounce everywhere, she's a winner, turn her gay. Preacher to a sinner, y'all, the one you want your mama to meet. She's a